Many organizations have a requirement to drop unsorted and uncategorized incoming documents into a centralized sorting or indexing location where someone can take a look at a document, decide what type of a document it is, and then route the document according to its type. When we talk about this kind of a scenario, it is commonly known as a document indexing system, where unindexed documents are delivered to a group of individuals for sorting and categorization. Now take this scenario a step further. Suppose that after the indexer has set the document type, we want the system to automatically move the document to the correct target library so that the responsible department can pick it up. For example, order forms should go to the sales library, commendations or complaints should go to the customer care library, invoices should go to finance, and so on. This K2 application build guide will lead you through building a document indexing solution that meets these requirements. Let's get down to the actual technical design of this application now. This is actually a very straightforward workflow. When a new document arrives in the Documents to Index library, regardless of how that document gets there, the workflow is going to be triggered to begin. The first step of the workflow will be to deliver a task to the members of the document indexing group, who will then need to open the document, decide what type of document it is, add notes, and then complete the task. Based on the document type selected by the document indexer, the system will determine which library the document should be moved to, and then move the document to the appropriate library. Because of potential volume of tasks for the document indexers group, we will not be sending a task notification email to these users when a new document arrives. Instead, we can rely on the users to access their tasks from the K2 work list app part, especially if this is one of the main points of their job. When you expect that an application workflow could potentially generate hundreds of tasks for users in a short period of time, it's going to be counterproductive to flood their inbox with that many task notifications. Now, for forms technology in this application, we will use K2 generated forms for the user interface. Note that the forms are not necessarily used to start the workflow because the workflow will automatically start whenever a new document is added to the library. We are using K2 Smart Forms for this application so that you can change the layout or behavior of the form that is used by the indexers to classify the document and complete the task. Although we will not be editing the form in this build guide, using K2 generated forms makes it possible for you to edit the user interfaces at some point in the future. Several document libraries will be used to build out our data sources for this application, along with a SharePoint list and a SharePoint permissions group. The central document library that our workflow will be associated with, called Documents to Index, will hold incoming and unclassified documents. When a document is added to this library, the workflow will automatically start for that document and show a task for all members of the document indexers group. The other libraries involved with this system will be target libraries for the indexed or classified documents to be moved to, such as HR, finance, customer care, etc. Now, in one of the really powerful aspects of this application design, we will store the document type routing rules, in other words, the mapping between document types and where they should be moved, in a separate SharePoint list called Document Type Routing. That way, you can easily add more document types and target libraries as time goes by without having to make any physical changes to the workflow. We will be using some of our own sample routing values in this build guide, but you are free to use whatever document types and libraries you would like in your list. Just remember that the target libraries must also exist in your SharePoint environment, otherwise the Move Document step will fail. In order to demonstrate the ability to assign tasks to a group of users, we will create a SharePoint group called Document Indexers for this application. This group will contain a number of users who are responsible for completing the index document step of the workflow. However, for the purposes of this application, we're only going to require one user from this group to action the task. The last thing we're going to include in this build guide is enabling standard K2 reporting for the application so that users can report on any workflow. And that's pretty much it for the design of our document indexing application. Now let's move on to the next phase of this demo where we will build the application elements and then bring it all together by testing it out. Let's quickly look at the steps we will take to build this application. In step 1, we will add the K2 app to a SharePoint site, take time to configure it, and drop the work list app part on the landing page of the site. During step 2, we will create our data sources for this application by setting up the necessary list, libraries, and document indexer SharePoint group that will be used by the K2 application. Step 3 will walk us through creating the K2 application off of the Documents to Index library, since this is going to be where documents that need to be indexed will be dropped. We will want the workflow to originate off of each document in this library as they are added to it. We will build out the document indexing workflow in step 4 by adding the user task, asking a user to set the document type for an unclassified document, as well as server steps needed to move documents to their target libraries. Once all of the build steps are complete, we will use step 5 to test the application by submitting a test document and indexing it. Finally, we will look at the workflow history reports in step 6. These reports are automatically created by K2 and will demonstrate how to use them to help you with your application auditing requirements. The first thing that you need to do when building a K2 application is add the K2 app to your SharePoint site and then configure it. In step 1, we will perform this task as well as add the K2 work list app part to the landing page of the site so that users can see their list of K2 tasks. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with that. When you want to create a K2 app with a SharePoint list or library, one of the first things you may need to do is add the K2 for SharePoint app to your site and optionally configure the app parts on one of your web part pages. This step may have already been performed on your site, so if that is the case, you can skip ahead to the next step. Keep in mind that if you have created a subsite and want to build K2 apps within it, you'll need to follow these steps to add the K2 for SharePoint app. In your SharePoint site, let's go into Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps to see what's available for this site. In this step, we want to add the K2 for SharePoint app to our site. So go ahead and select that option under the Apps You Can Add grouping. Now you should get a dialog box that pops up asking you to trust K2 for SharePoint. Since we know this is a trustworthy app, go ahead and click Trust It to begin the install. From here, you'll be directed back to your site contents page for this site. However, it may take a few seconds for the application to be completely added, so I'll pause the video and we'll come back once it completes. Okay, that's finished. We have one more step to complete before we can start building workflows, which is to configure the K2 for SharePoint app on this site. To get that moving, let's open the K2 for SharePoint application by clicking on it here. The first time you open this, it will take you through the registration wizard. On the first page, you'll need to confirm the SmartForms runtime URL is correct. For this demo, I can leave this set to the default URL and move on. However, keep in mind, your URL will be different if you're working inside your own environment. Just click on Next, and on the next window, K2 will take care of the configuration settings for you automatically. This will take a few seconds to complete, so I'll pause the video here. Okay, now that the configuration is complete, you ought to be able to validate that it worked by looking at all the green check marks next to each configuration section. It all looks pretty good here, so I'll go ahead and click Finish to move on to the next page. And that's pretty much it for the basic setup of K2 for SharePoint, so click on the name of your site to get back to the top. And also keep in mind that your site's name may be a bit different than mine as we work through this training together. So there will be a point where you're going to ask, how do my users open tasks that are assigned to them? Let's address that question now by adding the K2 Worklist app part to the landing page of our site. In order to do this, we'll edit the site landing page and then go to the Insert tab to find the App Part button from the ribbon menu. When you click on this, it will open up a list of app parts available to insert on the page. From here, select the K2 Worklist app part from the parts list, and then select the section of the page you want it to land on. In this case, all we get is rich content from the dropdown, so I'll leave it at that and click Add to get the work list visible on the site. Then to save this change back to SharePoint, click the Save button either to the left of the ribbon menu or in the upper right just above the ribbon menu. And once that saves and opens the page back up in display mode, you'll notice we have the K2 Worklist app part ready to go on the page. That's the end of step 1, so let's take a moment to consider what we just did. Note that the K2 for SharePoint app has only been installed for the current site, so if you want to use it in other SharePoint sites, even subsites under this one, you'll need to repeat these same steps to enable the K2 for SharePoint app in those sites. We added the K2 Worklist app part to this site so that users can open their K2 tasks from within this particular site. Adding the Worklist app part is optional. Your K2 application will still work just fine even if you do not add the Worklist app part to this site. However, you may want to consider centralizing the work list on another site within your organization so that users have a common place they all go to open their tasks. For the whole of step 2, we will be creating the data sources for our application. Starting with step 2.1, let's create the Document Indexers SharePoint group and add a couple of members to it. This will be used to assign the workflow's index document user task. Starting from the landing page of your SharePoint site, open the Site Settings from the menu option at the top right of your page. Once that page opens, select the People and Groups link under the Users and Permissions section to open up the People and Groups management page for your site. From the navigation bar on the left, select Groups, and then click the New button drop-down arrow and select New Group from the menu that appears. Let's call this group Document Indexers, and for now you can leave all the default settings as they are on the page. When you're ready, you can click the Create button down at the bottom to create the new group, and then once you've completed that, you should see a list of group members appear on your page. For this demonstration, I want to add a couple more users to this list. As you work through this step, feel free to use your own values for the group. In my example, I'm going to add Bob and Anthony as indexers for the new unsorted documents. I'm also going to leave my administrator account in the group for testing purposes. You can leave your own user account in the group for testing purposes as well. I'll go ahead and save that. And that's it for step 2.1. At this point in the lesson, we've created the Document Indexers group, which is going to be used by the workflow to assign the index document task to users. Next, we will create the document type routing list, which will store the mapping between document types and the target libraries. The workflow will use this list to determine where to move indexed files once the user completes their indexing task. To add our new list, back on the landing page of your SharePoint site, click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps, or if you'd like, you can open the Add an App page from the Site menu at the top right of your site page. We want to add a custom list to handle the document types, so from the list of apps under the Noteworthy section, select the Custom List option and then give the new list a name of Document Type Routing, and when you're done with that, click on the Create button to move on. We need to do some maintenance related to the columns for this list, so once the new list is created, open up the Settings page for it by selecting the Context menu for the list under Site Contents. From the Columns section, select the Title column and rename the column to Document Type. Doing this will add more context to this column rather than using the generic default name of Title, which SharePoint gives it. Finally, on this page, set the column to Enforce Unique Values, and then save the changes back to SharePoint by clicking on OK. You can also click OK on the question that appears about indexing the column to enforce unique values. We need to add one more column to this list, so back on the List Settings screen, click on Create Column in the Columns section, and then give the new column the name of Target Library. Once you've entered that, set the column to require that it contains information, and then you can click OK to save it out. Now that we've added the necessary columns to this list, we need to take a minute to populate the list with some data for the document type and the target library values, since this is the list we will use to decide which library a document should be moved based on the selected document type by our user. You don't have to use the values that we will provide here in our example, but do keep track of the target library values because you need to create those new libraries with the exact same names in the next step. I'm going to add the following items to the document type routing list to map document types to these target libraries. You can pause the video here and use this list of document types and library names as a reference if you'd like to populate your own list. Okay, great. I'm going to assume that you have populated your list with the items that you need to move forward. So let's take a brief moment to review. In this step, we created and populated the document type routing list, which will be used by the workflow to determine where to move a document, based on the document type that the indexer selects. In the next step, we will create the libraries for the application. Keep in mind that you will need to create a library for each of the target libraries you entered in the document type routing list, as well as a library to hold the incoming documents that need to be indexed. In step 2.3, we're going to create all of the document libraries for this application. This includes the Documents to Index library that will be the base for the workflow, as well as the target libraries for documents to be moved to once they are indexed. In order to create the libraries for this application, if you're not already on the landing page of your SharePoint site, take your browser back to that location, and then either click on Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps, or open the Site Settings menu at the top of the page again and click Add an App. We're going to start with the Documents to Index library for now. So select Document Library in here and give the new library the name of Documents to Index, and then click Create to move on. The next task is to set up the columns for this library. You can open the library settings from the Library tab menu at the top of the page. And then down in the Columns section, click on Create Column. And when the page opens up, go ahead and name the new column Document Type. And then you can select it as a lookup column of information that already exists on this site. Next, from within the Additional Column Settings section, select Document Type Routing as the list to get information from. Then you can select Document Type as the column if it isn't already set. And that's all we're going to do with this column at this point, which means you can click OK when you're ready. The next thing we need to do is add one more column to this library in order to capture comments from the document indexer. You can click on Create Column again and add a column called Comments, set it to the type Multiple Lines of Text, and leave the rest of the settings as they are, and click OK when you're ready. And that's all we're going to need to do for the Documents to Index library. So next we're going to create the libraries for each of the target libraries designated in the document type routing list that we set up earlier. Keep in mind, if you use different library names from mine in the previous step for target libraries, please create a new document library for each of those targets in your own environment. For the steps in this guide, I will use the library names as provided from my earlier sample, basically the 3 libraries defined in my routing list. So I'll return to the landing page of my site and use the Add an App link to add a new document library called HR. And I'll select the document library app from within here and name it HR and then click Create. If you're still hanging on with me, open the library settings for this new library in order to add the Comments column to it. Select Create Column from the Columns section of the page. Give it the name of Comments, and then set it to type Multiple Lines of Text. Then save it back to the SharePoint site when you're ready. An interesting thing about this column is the workflow will be set up to automatically populate it with comments entered by the document indexer over in the Documents to Index library, since it has the same name and type as the Comments column in that library. I'll show you how this is done when we get to the step to build out the workflow. We need to add the other target libraries from this point. I'm sure you well know that the procedure is going to be the same as we just followed to create the HR library on my site. In my case, I'm going to add the Finance library as well as the Customer Care library, while at the same time adding in the Comments column for both of them. I'm going to briefly pause the video here for the sake of time while I do this. If you do need help, feel free to take the video back to the point where we began creating the HR library for reference. Okay, if you're following the lesson with me, you should now have 3 target document libraries on your site, each with a Comments column. Take a moment to confirm that the library names are exactly the same as the values you entered in for the target libraries in the document type routing list. Because if you misname something or a target document library does not exist, the workflow will error out if you try to index the document and have it sent to the library in question. Let's take a moment to review this step. In this step, we added all the document libraries that will be used by the application. The nice thing about this design is you can always add additional libraries later on if you wish. Just remember to keep the document routing list updated with the appropriate routing rules, and remember to expose the libraries as smart objects, which is what we're going to learn how to do in the next step. So let's move on. In order to build our application from this point on, we need to expose these newly created lists and libraries to K2 so that they are available for use within the document indexing workflow. We will use step 2.4 to create the smart objects for each of these elements. To expose the list and libraries to K2 as smart objects, we need to go into the K2 for SharePoint app settings to make this happen. Again, if you're not already there, from the left side of your page, select the Site Contents menu option. Click on the K2 for SharePoint app to open up its settings. Notice the Smart Objects link under the Artifacts heading. You can select that link to open up the Manage Smart Objects page for your site. This action may take a few seconds, so I'll briefly pause the video. Let's start with the libraries by clicking the New Link option under the Libraries heading. Note this page may take a few seconds to finish loading. Inside the new Smart Object dialog box, put a check in each of the document libraries that you created in the previous step. And for the scope, select this site and all its subsites, and click OK when you're finished. Note again, K2 may take a few seconds to complete this task while it builds the Smart Object definitions for your libraries. Now, K2 also should have automatically created the Smart Object for the document type routing list down under the list section due to the Documents to Index library's dependency on it as a lookup column for the document type. To check if this is the case on your site, take a moment to refresh the Manage Smart Object page. And as you can see in my case, it did create the Smart Object for this list. If the document type routing list does not appear under the List section on your site, click on New under the Lists heading, and then in the new Smart Objects dialog box, select the document type routing list you created earlier and set the scope to this site and all of its subsites, and then click OK. With all of the smart objects created, your Manage Smart Objects screen should look something like mine here. If it does and you're happy, go ahead and click OK from this page and navigate back to your SharePoint site's landing page. Make a note here though, there may be additional smart objects for other libraries and lists if you've previously created K2 applications for this site. You can leave those smart objects alone and just move on. Let's quickly recap what we just did. In this step, we exposed the document type routing list as well as all the document libraries that will be used by the application as smart objects. This step is necessary because the only way the workflow can interact with the target libraries and list is if these are exposed as smart objects for all workflows in the site collection. Now that all the lists and libraries are set up, let's move on and start creating the K2 application around this. In step 3, we will create a new K2 application using the Documents to Index library. We want to use this library mainly because this is where new documents to be indexed will be dropped, and we want the workflow to start automatically whenever a new document is added to this library. From the landing page of your SharePoint site, open the Documents to Index library, and then open the K2 application settings from the library ribbon menu at the top of the page. Take a second to notice that the Data checkbox will already be selected for this library since smart objects are created by default when following this path. You can leave the option to allow the smart object to be used in workflows for this list library selected, since we definitely want it to be available for the indexing workflow later on. Down in the Forms section, select the option to create smart forms, and also make sure that it is set to enable the option to use K2 Smart Forms as the new, edit, and display forms for the list or library. Down in the Workflow section, select the option to create workflow and give it the workflow name of Document Indexing Workflow. Because we want this workflow to start on a document as soon as it's added to the library, Set the workflow up so that it starts whenever an item was added. And finally, in the Reports section, select the option to create reports. This will ensure that you have some automatic reporting available to review and audit information about this workflow throughout the course of time. And then when you're ready, click OK to start generating the K2 application elements. This may take a few seconds, but once it completes, you should be dropped into the Workflow Design tool. I'll go ahead and pause the video here while the K2 elements get created. Alright, now that the K2 application elements are created, we can move on to Step 4, which will lead us into building out the document indexing workflow. Step 4 is going to take us through multiple tasks to add steps to the document indexing workflow. We will take Step 4.1 and walk through adding the index document user task to the workflow. If you're coming in from the previous step where we added the K2 application elements, you should have been dropped right into the workflow design canvas for your application. Let's begin by adding the user task for this workflow. From the ribbon menu at the top of the page, switch to the general category on the left if it isn't already there. Then you can drag and drop a user task Smart Forms step into the first blank step of the workflow. On this first window, name the user task Index Document. This ends up being a descriptive name for the user task and will appear on your user's task list as such when they go to look at their task assignments. For the instruction box, you can enter in, please review the attached document, allocate it to a document type, save the changes, and then complete this task. This instruction will appear on the generated form as seen by the user when they are working their task, and it's used to tell the user what they need to do. For actions, we only have one for this particular task. Enter in indexing completed, and once you've entered that in, move on to configure the user form window. Because we want the user to be able to add comments for this document, leave the default form unchanged as Edit Document. You can move on to the Participants window next. We're going to set the participants for this indexing task back to the SharePoint user group that we created earlier called Document Indexers. For this to work, change the Search Type selector in the Search tab to Groups on the right side of the wizard window. And then enter in the group Document Indexers and click the Search button. When it appears, drag and drop the group into the Task Groups section on the left. As I mentioned earlier, we do not want to send a task notification to the user since they will use their K2 work list to open the task assignments. So you can leave the remaining options on the participant screen as is, and then click Finish to complete the wizard configuration. And that's all we need to configure for the user step in our workflow. So let's move on to step 4.2, where we will begin adding server tasks to this workflow. Document indexing, step 4.2, preview. In step 4.2, we will plug in our first server task where we will be using the Update Document Properties workflow step to rename the document with a unique name so that when it is moved, it will not overwrite any existing documents that may have the same name in the target document library. To update document properties in SharePoint, we need to go into the document-related workflow steps, which are located in the Documents menu group on the ribbon menu at the top of the page. Once you select that group, drag the Update Document Properties workflow step down to the next empty slot in your design canvas. Now, starting on the Specified Document window, leave the default setting pointing to a document that is referenced in this workflow as it is. K2 automatically adds a reference called Documents to Index in the workflow, which actually points to the document that started the workflow. By default, K2 will assume that this is the document we want to change in this step of the workflow, which is correct for our scenario. On the next window, called Specify Values, we want to rename the document so it uses a dynamically fashioned name by using the ID property of the workflow. This will ensure that when the document is moved to the target library, it does not overwrite another file that may have the same file name over there. Fortunately, the ID value of the workflow will always be unique, so that's an easy way to get a unique value that we can prepend to the file name. So expand the Workflow Context node in the context browser on the right, and drag and drop the ID field into the name text box. Next, type an underscore after the ID property that you just dropped in the name field, And then from the context browser, expand item references, and then expand the documents to index group, and drag the name property behind the underscore that you just typed. That completes our dynamic renaming of the document, so click Finish to complete the wizard. Let's take a minute to rename the new step to a more descriptive title for what the step is doing. You can do this by double-clicking on the title text of the workflow step icon, and then enter in Set Unique File Name. To prepare for the next workflow step, let's add a new outcome for this step called Continue. You can do this by hovering your mouse pointer over the Set Unique File Name step, and then click on the Workflow Step Outcomes icon that appears in the upper right. In the Workflow Step Outcomes window, click the Add button and enter in the word Continue, then click OK when you're done. Now your workflow should look something like mine on the screen here. Let's quickly review. In step 4.2, we added a server task where K2 will change the file name of the document so that it will always be unique when it gets moved to a target library. We did this because we do not want to overwrite any existing files in the target library when we move the document. In this case, we use the unique ID of the workflow that is associated with the document, and then add on the original file name. Now in step 4.3, we're going to add a task to the workflow that gives us a reusable reference to the target library for the document to be moved to based on the content type selected by the document indexer that completed the user task. Going back up to the ribbon menu at the top of the page, switch to the Libraries category, and then drag and drop a Get Library Reference step into the blank step of your workflow. On the Specify Site screen that appears, we need to point the wizard to the site where the target library exists, which for me is the portal site in my collection. Now, make a quick note here, if you are creating this application in a subsite like I am, type the path of the subsite in the subsite relative URL text box. In my case, I'm using a subsite called How2K2. Your values may be different, or if you are creating your application in a root site of a site collection, you can leave the subsite relative URL value blank. Next, we need to tell K2 the name of the library we want to create the reference for, and we can do this by using the document type routing list. This list will give us a cross-reference by using the target library name property from the smart object that exposes the document type routing list. We will use the document type that was assigned by the document indexer as a filter value input for this smart object, which will then return the associated library name for the reference. Using the context browser on the right, expand the Smart Objects node, and then open the document type routing smart object. In the list of methods for this smart object, expand the getListItemByTitle method, and then drag and drop the target library property into the name text box, as shown on my window. You'll notice as soon as we drop the field, a dialog box pops up asking us to enter the document type. From the context browser again, expand Item References, and then expand the Documents to Index node, which points to the document library, and drop the document type value property into the document type text box as demonstrated on my screen. This sets the values we need to define the library reference, so click OK to close the target library screen when you're ready. One last item we need to take care of in the Specify Site window, at the bottom of the window, give the reference a name of Target Library. When you do this, it will be visible in the item reference area of the context browser when we want to use this reference in later workflow steps. Once you've entered that in, you can click OK to finish this wizard out. To prepare for the next step, add a new outcome off of the Get Library Reference step by clicking on the Workflow Step Outcomes icon that appears when hovering over this new step. Then click the Add button and enter in Continue. When you're done with that, you can click OK. Now at this point, let's back up our work by saving the workflow. You can do this by selecting the file from the menu at the top left of your screen, and then click Save. If everything is complete on your screen, your workflow should look something like mine here. Now let's take another moment to briefly review this step. In this step, we use the Get Library Reference wizard to get a reference or pointer to the target library where the document should be moved. Rather than hard-coding a library name, we use the result of a method that reads from the document type routing list smart object to determine the name of the library where we want to move the document. This is the crucial part that makes this application work well. Remember, we can maintain the list of document types and libraries in the SharePoint list without having to change the workflow. The workflow will ask the list which library the document should be moved to based on the document type entered by the indexer. In our next step, we will add a task to move the document to this target library. Now we need to configure the workflow to move the document to the target library. In step 4.4, we will use the Move Document Workflow step to perform this task. To find the Move Document step, go up to the ribbon menu at the top of the page and switch to the Documents category group. Then drag and drop a Move Document step into the new blank step of the workflow. Remember, K2 by default assumes that you want to use the document that started the workflow in this case. In the Specified Document screen, use the default reference, Documents to Index, and click Next. This next window brings into play the library reference we just created in step 4.3 using the Get Library Reference workflow step. In the Specify Destination screen, select the option to use a library that is referenced in this workflow and select the target library reference that we just added in the previous step. This technique is very handy if you have multiple steps in your workflow that need to reference this library. By configuring the reference the way we did, we only have to set up the filtering once during design time to use it multiple times down the road, thus speeding up our design time for larger workflows. Go ahead and click Finish at this point. This is the last step of our workflow. By adding in this step that moves the original document to the target library, we can move on to the next step where we can deploy the workflow to the K2 system to make it available to users. In step 4.5, we will deploy the document indexing workflow to the K2 system. There isn't much to this step, so let's get started. To deploy the workflow, click on the File menu at the top of the page, and then select the Deploy option. At this point, K2 is checking the workflow for errors and validating that it is ready to deploy to the system. Once it works through that, it will automatically push the workflow out. This may take a few seconds, so I'll pause the video. Okay, your workflow is deployed when you see the success message. We can go back to the K2 Application Elements screen now by clicking on the Close and Exit button. We won't need to perform any more tasks on this page, so you can use the navigation link at the top of the screen to return to your Documents to Index library, where we can then move on to step 5 of the build guide, which walks through a test run of our new application. Now that the K2 application is complete, let's test it out by submitting a test document and then index it in step 5. In your SharePoint site, open the Documents to Index library and then upload a new document. Once you get here, do not fill in values for the document type or comments at this point in time. We'll leave that for our indexer group to handle. You could add a title to the document if you want. I'll just add Sample Document 1 as the title here. And when you're ready, click Save on the new document form to add the document and kick off the workflow. Once the new document is added to the library, open your SharePoint site as one of the members of the Document Indexers group that you created in Step 2 of this guide, or just leave it open as yourself and go back to your landing page. From my site, I'll open up a browser instance as Anthony, and when the site page loads, we should see a task for him listed in the K2 work list app part. I'm going to click on the task to open the Edit Document form, and then select one of the available values in the document type drop-down list to categorize this document. Let's call this an invoice for now. And then I'll add some comments stating this is a test for the indexing application, and click the Save button to save it back to the SharePoint library. Feel free to click the link to open the document as well and review the document contents if you'd like. Then select Indexing Completed in the Select Action drop-down list up in the K2 section and submit the form back to K2. You should see a success message that the item was submitted. This also should close the task out from the user's task list and move the document on to the other library. We'll need to wait a few seconds here for K2 to process the workflow and physically move the document, so I'll pause the video for a moment. Okay, now let's go to the library where the document should have been moved. In my example, I selected Invoice, therefore the document should have landed in the Finance library, according to the rules defined in our document type routing list. Great, you can see that the document was moved to this library and it was actually given a new, unique name as well. Remember that because the comments field existed in the Documents to Index library, K2 also brought them over with the document and we didn't have to configure the workflow step to do this. You also see that the modified by value may be something like SharePoint app because the system itself moved the document and not a particular user. But keep in mind your values may be a bit different than mine if you're running this in your own environment. Let's quickly go back to the Documents to Index library and verify that the test document we uploaded no longer appears in this library. And as you can see, the document no longer exists here, which leads to a successful test of our application. And that sums up this test for the Document Indexing K2 application. Stick around for a few more minutes because I'd like to walk you through how to use the K2 reports we enabled on the application to provide audit and reporting history for our workflow in Step 6. In our final build step, we will run a report to look at workflow statistics and validate that the enabled K2 reporting is working as expected. To view reports related to workflows for this library, open the Documents to Index library and then click the Library tab at the top of the page. We can get to the K2 reports by clicking on the Reports icon over in the K2 menu group on the ribbon menu. Once the Reports page loads, let's click on the Instance Count bar graph to populate the Workflow Instances report. You should see at least one workflow listed with the folio that is the name of the document that you uploaded. Click on an instance of that workflow, and notice that you also get a view into the activity instances for this workflow down at the bottom of the page. This shows activity duration, priority, and status amongst other things. Now let's take a look at the ViewFlow report for this instance, which is also available here by clicking on the ViewFlow link to graphically verify that the workflow completed. Once the ViewFlow report opens, we can click on the Index Document step and then the Participants tab in the dialog box that opens up to see who completed the task. Notice in my example it was Anthony. And that's pretty much it. In this step, we tested that the reports for our new application are working as expected. Now let's go back and take a moment to review everything that we've learned in this lesson. In this demonstration, I showed you how you can automate a typical back-office administrative task like document indexing with a K2 application. Let's review some of the items you'll be taking away from this lesson now. We learned how to wire up and start a workflow when a new document is added to a SharePoint library. Once this document goes through an indexing review by a user, we configured a workflow step to use a SharePoint list as a lookup for business rules to move the document between document libraries. This allowed us to dynamically determine which library to move the document to as opposed to selecting a specific library at workflow design time in a hard-coding fashion. We used a SharePoint group to designate the participants for a user task, thus allowing us to manage participants outside of the workflow design as well. To prevent overwriting a document in a target library, we renamed the file using a workflow step. We also learned how to call a smart object method to retrieve a value for a workflow wizard. We would like to thank you for working through this document indexing build guide video with us. We hope you have a better understanding of how to use the techniques in this guide to build workflow solutions in your organization.